Alright, so in this tutorial we're going to set up lights inside of Maya. I'll assume that when you do this you've got your texture maps in and they're working as they should be when you render. So in order to go ahead and do that, I'm going to go to Create. And just like every other element inside of Maya, we would go to the Create menu. I'm going to go to Lights, and I'm going to start out with the spotlight. And what you'll notice is that in the center of your viewport, you'll see the vertices. And I'm going to hit 4 on the keyboard because it always introduces the light right in the middle of your document window. So I'm going to do that so I can kind of get at this a little easier. And I'll zoom back a bit here. And I'm going to just pull that directly above, out of the floor, and somewhere in the middle of the room like so. Now, I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, and you'll notice that when you do, it changes the cone icon of the spotlight to two vertices, sets of vertices basically. And the one without the icon is the target, which means I would take this and I can direct this where I would like the light to point to. And I'm putting it directly over this little desk just because that's, you can see that's pretty much the only thing in this room. Now I want to see what this is kind of looking like. So 6 will give you textures, 7 will give you a rough idea of where your light is pointing and the circumference of it, or the cone angle as it's stated over here in the attribute window. Now at this point, if you don't see the attribute window, you have to use Control A on the keyboard to get it. You'll see these icons if you click on the middle tab of these 3 light tabs that you see in the attributes. So what I'm going to do immediately is I'm going to go down, and I want the light to be pretty soft around the edges, because if you recall from the tutorial, if I were to go ahead and render this with the IPR, I'm going to get a shape that is nothing more than this hard kind of a cartoonish light circle, and that's really not too desirable. So I'll close that out, and I'm going to go over and I'm going to change the penumbra angle, and that will just soften the edge of my light. So if I had made it -10 or +10 or minus a number or plus a number, it would simply soften it. Okay, so the minus number contracts the cone angle or the circumference of that light source, whereas a plus number will increase it and put the soft edge on as well. Now I'm going to bump up the angle so I can make this a little bit more obvious what I'm doing in lighting. Once again, I'm going to click on the IPR to get a quick render. And now my light's going to be considerably softer. So I've got the start on this. Now, the successful lighting really takes place when you use multiple lights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this one here. And I think what I'll do is I'll change the angle, because we've spoken about diagonals and compositions, whether it's 2D, 3D is no different. So I've just basically changed that cone angle. Maybe I'll manipulate that source, that target area, excuse me, to kind of encompass a little bit more of my table surface. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to light up this bird that appears over here. I'm going to hit 6 on the keyboard so we can see this content a little easier. So 6 will take me back to texture maps, but it'll kind of turn the light off momentarily so that I can see the rest of my model. So with that light selected, I'm going to hit Command D, and I'm going to drag the new light over to the other side of the room a bit. I'm going to have this kind of in the area where that bird appears here. So if I were to hold down V on the keyboard and then drag my target, I can snap it to the general vicinities and then snap right to that bird. So I'm going to give that a quick render. Again, I'm using the IPR just to get a rough idea of what this light looks like. I'll have to go in and use Raytrace afterwards, because I've got a little mirror that appears on the desktop here. So I want that to reflect, but I'm just kind of taking this is kind of a rough approach to get the lights at the right intensity and position. So that's pretty good. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to drop the intensity of these lights because it's pretty bright. Things are kind of burning out here. So I'll go over with this light that's above the bird, and maybe I'll just make that intensity 0.7. And, you know, as I think I kind of prefaced in our tutorial, this is probably the hardest part of mine, is the lighting rendering. So what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll drop the intensity over here, both to 0.7. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and render and see what that gives me. All right, so I'll kind of manipulate the view to a shot I might find desirable. Click on IPR. And that's looking much better. I could really go a lot further here. Maybe I'll move this down so it's pointing at the bird more. So I'm kind of pulling it down like so. And once again, if I hit 7 on the keyboard, I have a better idea of what's going on here. So you can see I'm kind of pointing it more at that crow or whatever that is over here. Okay, now I see that this corner of the table is no longer lit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this, and I think I'll just move this over like so. I want that skull to cast a nice shadow, so I'm going to pull it this way as well. There we go. All right, so I'm not so concerned about the chair, more the desktop. So I'll go ahead and I'll kind of get a shot set up here. Again, I'm just roughly moving this view for the render, and I'll click on that. And that's looking much better. All right, now that I've got the light set up the way I want, I'm going to go and introduce the shadows and then ray trace and start to render and see how this looks as I approach the final renders. So what I'll do is I'll go to my lights and I'll select this one, and I'm going to go over the attribute editor. And again, if you don't see it, hit Control A on the keyboard and you'll see this, this series of tabs, and then one in particular in the middle is the one we want that will allow us to access these changes. So I'm going to scroll down and open up the shadow tab if it's not yet open. Okay, so I'll open up my shadow tab, and then I'll scroll down to the bottom, and I'll make sure I use ray trace is engaged for that light. So if a light needs to cast a shadow, you will want to make sure that ray trace is on. Otherwise, you don't need to put this on if in fact it's not going to, that light you've chosen will not need a shadow. So I've got ray trace on both of these. Now, in order for me to actually render out these shadows, I have to go to the render settings. And the render settings are at the top of the user interface here. And it's the Hollywood clapboard that's got these two little buttons to the left of it. All right, so I'm going to click on that, and it's going to give me my render settings. So I'm not so much concerned about what's on the Common tab up here, but on the Maya Software tab, I want to do two things. First of all, I would probably change the quality if I was doing my final renders at this point to production quality. And then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and I'm going to open up the Raytrace tab, and I'm going to make sure that Raytrace tab is clicked on. All right, so that's pretty much all I need to do at this point. So I'm going to close that out. And if you've noticed, there's a skin on either side of my viewport here, and that is the camera view, essentially. So in order to get that, if you recall, there's a white box with a blue ball here. And when I click on and off, it'll introduce that camera skin so that I can have a more accurate idea of the actual parameters of the shot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this up a bit for now. And I'm going to kind of zoom in because I'm really kind of concerned about the top of the desk at this point and the shadows that the skull might cast and our pen and these papers. So now I'm going to click on the final render button. Now the final render button is also up here, and it's to the left of the IPR. If you recall, IPR meant instant photographic rendering, and it didn't give us a lot of the features that we want, especially this ray trace. So this is the one we're going to be dealing with in a moment. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to click on that and see what I've got thus far. Okay, so you can see that it's giving me all my shadows, and it looks pretty decent. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change this light because I do want to see more of this skull, and I don't want this shadow being cast so far across the paper. So I might do two things. First of all, I'll redirect the light more towards the front of the desk, and then I'm also going to drop the opacity of that shadow. Okay, so I'm just redirecting that light, and then I'm going to go to the attributes over here for that light, and if I go up towards the top of the shadow tab, you'll see shadow color. So we're going to drag that to the right. So now when I give that the final gather render, two things will happen. There'll be more light on the front of the skull, and then the shadows will be a little less opaque.